Chapter 10. Pestov liked thrashing an argument out to the end, and was not satisfied with Sergei Ivanovitch's words, especially as he felt the injustice of his view. "I did not mean," he said over the soup, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch, "mere density of population alone, but in conjunction with fundamental ideas, and not by means of principles." "It seems to me," Alexey Alexandrovitch said languidly, and with no haste, that's the same thing. In my opinion, influence over another people is only possible to the people who has the higher development, which—" "But that's just the question," Pestov broke in. He was always in a hurry to speak, and seemed always to put his whole soul into what he was saying. "In what are we to make higher development consist? The English, the French, the Germans? Which is at the highest stage of development? Which of them will nationalize the other? We see the Rhine provinces, which have been turned French, but the Germans are not at a lower stage," he shouted. "There is another law at work there." "I fancy that the greater influence is always on the side of true civilization," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, slightly lifting his eyebrows. "But what are we to lay down as the outward signs of true civilization?" said Pestov. "I imagine such signs are generally very well known," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "But are they fully known?" Sergei Ivanovitch put in with a subtle smile. "It is the accepted view now that real culture must be purely classical, but we see most intense disputes on each side of the question, and there is no denying that the opposite camp has strong points in its favor." "You are for classics, Sergei Ivanovitch. Will you have some red wine?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I am not expressing my own opinion of either form of culture," Sergei Ivanovitch said, holding out his glass with a smile of condescension, as to a child. "I only say that both sides have strong arguments to support them," he went on, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch. "My sympathies are classical from education, but in this discussion I am personally unable to arrive at a conclusion. I see no distinct grounds for classical studies being given a preeminence over scientific studies." "The natural sciences have just as great an educational value," put in Pestov. "Take astronomy, take botany, take zoology, with the systems of general principles." "I cannot quite agree with that," responded Alexey Alexandrovitch. "It seems to me that one must admit that the very process of studying the forms of language has a peculiarly favorable influence on intellectual development. Moreover, it cannot be denied that the influence of the classical authors is in the highest degree moral, while, unfortunately, with the study of the natural sciences are associated the false and noxious doctrines which are the curse of our day." Sergei Ivanovitch would have said something, but Pestov interrupted him in his deep voice. He began warmly contesting the justice of this view. Sergei Ivanovitch waited serenely to speak, obviously with a convincing reply ready. "But," said Sergei Ivanovitch, smiling subtly and addressing Karenina, "one must allow that to weigh all the advantages and disadvantages of classical and scientific studies is a difficult task, and the question which form of education was to be preferred would not have been so quickly and conclusively decided if there had not been in favor of classical education, as you expressed it just now, its moral, anti-nihilistic influence. Undoubtedly. If it had not been for the distinctive property of anti-nihilistic influence on the side of the classical studies, we should have considered the subject more, have weighed the arguments of both sides, said Sergey Ivanovitch with a subtle smile. We should have given elbow room to both tendencies. But now we know that these little pills of classical learning possess the medicinal property of anti-nihilism, and we boldly prescribe them to all our patients. But what if they had no such medicinal property? He wound up humorously. Stepan Arkadyevitch had not made a mistake in inviting Pestov. With Pestov, intellectual conversation never flagged for an instant. Directly Sergey Ivanovitch had concluded the conversation with his jest, Pestov promptly started a new one. I can't agree even, said he, that the government had that aim. The government obviously is guided by abstract considerations and remains indifferent to the influence its measures may exercise. The education of women, for instance, would naturally be regarded as likely to be harmful, but the government opens schools and universities for women. And the conversation at once passed to the new subject of the education of women. Alexey Alexandrovitch expressed the idea that the education of women is apt to be confounded with the emancipation of women, and that is only so that it can be considered dangerous. I consider, on the contrary, that the two questions are inseparably connected together, said Pestov. It is a vicious circle. Woman is deprived of rights from lack of education, and the lack of education results from the absence of rights. We must not forget that the subjection of women is so complete and dates from such ages back that we are often unwilling to recognize the gulf that separates them from us, said he. You said rights, said Sergey Ivanovitch, waiting till Pestov had finished, meaning the rights of sitting on juries, of voting, of presiding at official meetings, the right of entering the civil service, of sitting in Parliament? Yes, undoubtedly. But if women, as a rare exception, can occupy such positions, it seems to me you are wrong in using the expression rights. It would be more correct to say duties. Every man will agree that in doing the duty of a juryman, a witness, a telegraph clerk, we feel we are performing duties, and therefore it would be correct to say that women are seeking duties, and quite legitimately, and one can but sympathize with this desire to assist in the general labor of man. Quite so, Alexey Alexandrovitch assented. The question, I imagine, is simply whether they are fitted for such duties. They will most likely be perfectly fitted, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, when education has become general among them. We see this. What seems to me is that women should seek fresh duties, said Sergey Ivanovitch, while we see, unhappily, that men usually try to avoid them. Duties are bound up with rights, power, money, honor. These are what women are seeking, said Pestov. Just as though I should seek the right to be a wet nurse and feel injured because women are paid for the work while no one will take me, said the old prince. Turovstin exploded in a loud roar of laughter, and Sergey Ivanovitch regretted that he had not made this comparison. Even Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled. "Yes, but a man can't nurse a baby," said Pestov, "while a woman—" "No, there was an Englishman who did suckle his baby on board ship," said the old prince, feeling this freedom in conversation permissible before his own daughters. "There are as many such Englishmen as there would be women officials," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "Yes, but what is a girl to do who has no family?" put in Stepan Arkadyevitch, thinking of Masha Dereshova, whom he had had in mind all along, and sympathizing with Pestov and supporting him. If the story of such a girl were thoroughly sifted, you would find she had abandoned a family, her own or a sister's, or she might have found a woman's duties. Darya Alexandrovna broke in unexpectedly in a tone of exasperation, probably suspecting what sort of girl Stepan Arkadyevitch was thinking of. "But we take our stand on principle as the ideal," replied Pestov in his calm voice. "Woman desires to have rights, to be independent, educated. She is oppressed, humiliated by the consciousness of her disabilities." "And I'm oppressed and humiliated that they won't engage me at the Foundling," the old prince said again, to the huge delight of Turovstin, who in his mirth dropped his asparagus with the thick end in the sauce. Chapter 11. Everyone took part in the conversation, except Kitty and Levin. At first, when they were talking of the influence that one people has on another, there rose to Levin's mind what he had to say on the subject. But these ideas, once of such importance in his eyes, seemed to come into his brain as in a dream, and had now not the slightest interest for him. It even struck him as strange that they should be so eager to talk of what was of no use to anyone. Kitty, too, should, one would have supposed, have been interested in what they were saying of the rights and education of women. How often she had mused on the subject, thinking of her friend abroad, Varenka, of her painful state of dependence. How often she had wondered about herself, what would become of her if she did not marry, and how often she had argued with her sister about it. But it did not interest her at all. She and Levin had a conversation of their own, yet not a conversation, but some sort of mysterious communication which brought them every moment nearer, and stirred in both a sense of glad terror before the unknown into which they were entering. At first, Levin, in answer to Kitty's questions how he could have seen her last year in the carriage, told her how he had been coming home from the mowing along the high road and had met her. "It was very, very early in the morning. You were probably only just awake. Your mother was asleep in the corner. It was an exquisite morning. I was walking along wondering who it could be in a four in hand. It was a splendid set of 4 horses with bells, and in a second you flashed by, and I saw you at the window. You were sitting like this, holding the strings of your cap in both hands, and thinking deeply about something," he said, smiling. "How I should like to know what you were thinking about. Something important? Wasn't I dreadfully untidy?" she wondered. But seeing the smile of ecstasy these memories called up, she felt that the impression she had made had been very good. She blushed and laughed with delight. "I really don't remember." how nicely Turovtsin laughs," said Levin, admiring his moist eyes and shaking chest. "Have you known him long?" asked Kitty. "Oh, everyone knows him." "And I see you think he's a horrid man?" "Not horrid, but there's nothing to him." "Oh, you're wrong, and you must give up thinking so directly," said Kitty. "I used to have a very poor opinion of him, too, but he's an awfully nice and wonderfully good-hearted man. He has a heart of gold." "How could you know what sort of heart he has?" "We are great friends. I know him very well. Last winter, soon after you came to see us," she said, with a guilty and at the same time confiding smile, "all Dolly's children had scarlet fever, and he happened to come and see her. And only fancy," she said in a whisper, "he felt so sorry for her that he stayed and began to help her look after the children. Yes, and for 3 weeks he stayed with them and looked after the children like a nurse." "I am telling Konstantin Dmitrovitch about Turovtsin and the scarlet fever," she said, bending over to her sister. "Oh, yes, it was wonderful, noble," said Dolly, glancing towards Turovtsin, who had become aware they were talking of him, and smiling gently to him. Levin glanced once more at Turovtsin, and wondered how it was he had not realized all this man's goodness before. I'm sorry, and I'll never think ill of people again," he said gaily, genuinely expressing what he felt at the moment. Chapter 12. Connected with the conversation that had sprung up on the rights of women, there were certain questions as to the inequality of rights in marriage improper to discuss before the ladies. Pestov had several times during dinner touched upon these questions, but Sergei Ivanovitch and Stepan Arkadyevitch carefully drew him off them. When they rose from the table and the ladies had gone out, Pestov did not follow them, but addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch, began to expound the chief ground of inequality. The inequality in marriage, in his opinion, lay in the fact that the infidelity of the wife and the infidelity of the husband are punished unequally, both by the law and by public opinion. Stepan Arkadyevitch went hurriedly up to Alexey Alexandrovitch and offered him a cigar. "No, I don't smoke," Alexey Alexandrovitch answered calmly, as though purposely wishing to show that he was not afraid of the subject. He turned to Pestov with a chilly smile. "I imagine that such a view has a foundation in the very nature of things," he said, and would have gone on to the drawing-room. But at this point Turovtsin broke unexpectedly into the conversation, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch. "You heard, perhaps, about Pryatchnikov," said Turovtsin, warmed up by the champagne he had drunk, and long waiting for an opportunity to break the silence that had weighed upon him. "Vasya Pryatchnikov," he said, with a good-natured smile on his damp red lips, addressing himself principally to the most important guest, Alexey Alexandrovitch. "They told me today that he fought a duel at Tver and has killed him." Just as always seems that one bruises oneself on a sore place, so Stepan Arkadyevitch felt now that the conversation would by ill luck fall every moment on Alexey Alexandrovitch's sore spot. He would again have gotten his brother-in-law away, but Alexey Alexandrovitch himself inquired with curiosity, "What did Pryatchnikov fight about?" His wife. He acted like a man, he did. He called him out and shot him. Ah, said Alexey Alexandrovitch indifferently, and lifting his eyebrows, he went into the drawing-room. How glad I am you have come, Dolly said with a frightened smile, meeting him in the outer drawing-room. I must talk to you. Let us sit here. Alexey Alexandrovitch, with the same expression of indifference given him by his lifted eyebrows, sat down beside Darya Alexandrovna and smiled affectedly. It's fortunate, said he, especially as I was meaning to ask you to excuse me and to be taking leave. I have to start tomorrow. Darya Alexandrovna was firmly convinced of Anna's innocence, and she felt herself growing pale and her lips quivering with anger at this frigid, unfeeling man who was so calmly intending to ruin her innocent friend. Alexey Alexandrovitch, she said, looking him in the face with desperate resolution. I asked you about Anna. You made me no answer. How is she? She is, I believe, quite well, Darya Alexandrovna, replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, not looking at her. Alexey Alexandrovitch, forgive me. I have no right, but I love Anna as a sister, and I esteem her. I beg, I beseech you to tell me what is wrong between you. What fault do you find with her? Alexey Alexandrovitch frowned, and almost closing his eyes, dropped his head. I presume that your husband has told you the grounds on which I consider it necessary to change my attitude to Anna Arkadyevna, he said, not looking her in the face, but eyeing with displeasure Sherbatsky, who was walking across the drawing-room. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I can't believe it, Dolly said, clasping her bony hands before her with a vigorous gesture. She rose quickly and laid her hand on Alexey Alexandrovitch's sleeve. We shall be disturbed here. Come this way, please. Dolly's agitation had an effect on Alexey Alexandrovitch. He got up and submissively followed her to the schoolroom. They sat down to a table covered with an oilcloth cut and slit by penknives. I don't believe it. I don't believe it, Dolly said, trying to catch his glance that avoided her. One cannot disbelieve facts, Darya Alexandrovna, said he, with an emphasis on the word facts. But what has she done? Said Darya Alexandrovna. What precisely has she done? She has forsaken her duty and deceived her husband. That is what she has done, he said. No, it can't be. No, for God's sake, you're mistaken, said Dolly, putting her hands to her temples and closing her eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled coldly, with his lips alone, meaning to signify to her and to himself the firmness of his conviction. But this warm defense, though it could not shake him, reopened his wound. He began to speak with greater heat. It is extremely difficult to be mistaken when a wife herself informs her husband of the fact, informs him that 8 years of her life and a son, that is all a mistake, and that she wants to begin life again, he said angrily. Anna and sin? I cannot connect them. I cannot believe it. Darya Alexandrovna, he said, now looking straight into Dolly's kindly, troubled face, and feeling that his tongue was being loosened in spite of himself. I would give a great deal for doubt to be still possible. When I doubted, I was miserable, but it was better than now. When I doubted, I had hope, but now there is no hope, and still I doubt everything. I am in such doubt of everything that I even hate my son, and sometimes do not believe he is my son. I am very unhappy." He had no need to say that. Darya Alexandrovna had seen that as soon as he glanced into her face, and she felt sorry for him, and her faith in the innocence of her friend began to totter. "Oh, this is awful, awful. But can it be true that you are resolved on a divorce?" "I am resolved on extreme measures. There is nothing else for me to do." "Nothing else to do, nothing else to do," she replied with tears in her eyes. "Oh no, don't say nothing else to do," she said. "What is horrible in a trouble of this kind is that one cannot, as in any other, in loss and death, bear one's trouble in peace, but that one must act," said he, as though guessing her thought. "One must get out of the humiliating position in which one is placed. One can't live à trois." "I understand. I quite understand that," said Dolly, and her head sank. She was silent for a little, thinking of herself, of her own grief and her family, and all at once, with an impulsive movement, she raised her head and clasped her hands with an imploring gesture. "But wait a little. You are a Christian. Think of her. What will become of her if you cast her off?" "I have thought, Darya Alexandrovna. I have thought a great deal," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. His face turned red in patches, and his dim eyes looked straight before him. Darya Alexandrovna at that moment pitied him with all her heart. "That was what I did, indeed, when she herself made known to me my humiliation. I left everything as of old. I gave her a chance to reform. I tried to save her. And with what result? She would not regard the slightest request. That she should observe decorum," he said, getting heated. "One may save anyone who does not want to be ruined, but if the whole nature is so corrupt, so depraved, that ruin itself seems to be her salvation, then what is to be done?" "Anything, only not divorce," answered Darya Alexandrovna. "But what is anything?" "No, it is awful. She will be no one's wife. She will be lost." "What can I do?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch, raising his shoulders and his eyebrows. The recollection of his wife's last act had so incensed him that he had become frigid, as at the beginning of the conversation. "I am very grateful for your sympathy, but I must be going," he said, getting up. "No, wait a minute. You must not ruin her. Wait a little. I will tell you about myself. I was married, and my husband deceived me. In anger and jealousy, I would have thrown out everything. I would myself. But I came to myself again. And who did it? Anna saved me. And here I am, living on. The children are growing up. My husband has come back to his family and feels his fault, is growing purer, better, and I live on. I have forgiven it, and you ought to forgive." Alexey Alexandrovitch heard her, but her words had no effect on him now. All the hatred of that day when he had resolved on a divorce had sprung up again in his soul. He shook himself and said in a shrill, loud voice, Forgive I cannot and do not wish to, and I regard it as wrong. I have done everything for this woman, and she has trodden it all in the mud to which she is akin. I am not a spiteful man. I have never hated anyone. But I hate her with my whole soul, and I cannot even forgive her, because I hate her too much for all the wrong she has done me, he said, and the tones of hatred were clear in his voice. Love those that hate you, Darya Alexandrovna whispered timorously. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled contemptuously. That he knew long ago, but it could not be applied to his case. Love those that hate you, but to love those one hates is impossible. Forgive me for having troubled you. Everyone has enough to bear in his own grief. And regaining his self-possession, Alexey Alexandrovitch quietly took leave and went away.